The massive station called Harmony's Edge floated in the dark space between stars, and its gleaming metal halls were filled with panic today, because something terrible was happening to the galaxy, and nobody knew how to stop it. Commander Taeho, Kim stood on the bridge of his ship watching the stars through the thick glass windows. When the emergency message arrived and the voice from the communication system made his blood run cold, because it was from the Galactic Council. And they never called Earth unless something was very wrong. The message was simple but terrifying, and it said that the Void Swarm had returned after sleeping for 1,000 years, and this time they were eating entire star systems and turning everything into more of themselves, and every military force in the galaxy had tried to fight them and failed. Taeho looked at the data on his screen and saw the red marks spreading across the galaxy map like a disease, and each red mark was a dead solar system, where billions of people used to live, and now there was nothing but empty space and floating metal scraps. He called his team to the meeting room, and they came quickly because they could see the worry on his face, and Ji-Woo Lee was the first to arrive, followed by So-Min Choi and Hyun-Woo Kang, and they all sat down around the metal table while Taeho showed them the message. Ji-Woo was their tactical officer, and she was very good at understanding battle plans, and when she saw the data, her face went pale because she realized how bad things were, and she said that 3 entire sectors had been destroyed in just 1 week. So-Min was their best engineer, and she could fix anything that was broken. But even she looked scared when she saw the technical reports about the Void Swarm, because their ship seemed to be made of living metal that could change shape and phase in and out of normal space. Hyun-Woo handled all their communications, and he was usually cheerful, but today he was quiet because he had been listening to the emergency broadcast from across the galaxy, and they were all saying the same thing, which was that nobody could fight these creatures and win. The reports said that the Void Swarm was like nothing anyone had ever seen before, because they were not just machines or living things, but something that was both and neither at the same time, and they could make themselves invisible to most weapons, and they ate planets the way a person might eat. An apple. Taeho read the tactical data out loud, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking a little, and he told his team that the Chronari had sent their greatest warriors, and they had been destroyed in minutes, and the Velthian energy weapons had passed right through the swarm ships like they were made of air. The worst part was that every time the swarm destroyed a ship or consumed a planet, they seemed to get smarter and stronger, and some scientists thought they were learning from everything they destroyed and adding that knowledge to their collective mind. Meanwhile, on the station, Harmony's Edge ambassador Nari Park was walking through corridors filled with alien delegates, and she had never seen so many different species looking so frightened at the same time, because fear was something that looked the same on every face, whether it was human or alien. The main council chamber was huge, with seats arranged in circles going up toward the ceiling, and each seat was made for a different kind of alien body, and today every seat was filled because this was the most important meeting in galactic history. Prime Minister Zelthara of the Velthians was speaking, and her voice was like music, but today it sounded broken and sad as she explained how her people's most advanced ships had been unable to even scratch the swarm vessels, and her pilots had watched in horror as their energy beams went right through the enemy. General Voxmar of the Chronari was a huge creature that looked like a walking mountain, and his people were famous for being the strongest warriors in the galaxy. But even he admitted that strength meant nothing against enemies that could become like ghosts whenever they wanted. Andromedan representatives showed holographic images of the battle at Kepler 7, and everyone watched in silence as a single swarm ship destroyed an entire fleet of defenders, and then began eating the planet itself, starting with the cities, and working its way down to the Chronari. Listened to all of this and felt a cold feeling in her stomach, because she knew that Earth was going to be asked to help. And Earth was just a small planet with primitive technology compared to these great civilizations, but somehow they were the only ones who had not been asked yet. When her turn came to speak, Nari stood up and looked around at all the alien faces staring at her, and she could see that most of them thought humans were too weak and primitive to make any difference. But she also saw something else in their eyes, which was desperate hope. She told them that Earth would send its forces to help fight the Void Swarm, even though she knew that many humans would die, and even though she was not sure they could win, but she also knew that sometimes the only choice was to fight even when victory seemed impossible. The alien delegates whispered among themselves, and some of them seemed relieved that someone was willing to try, while others seemed to think that sending humans to fight the swarm was like sending children to fight dragons. But Nari ignored their whispers and made her promise official. Back on Earth, the news spread quickly, and people gathered around screens in their homes and workplaces to watch as their leaders explained what was happening and what they were going to do about it. And there was fear. But there was also something else, which was determination. Tae-ho received new orders within hours, and they told him to prepare the first expeditionary fleet for immediate departure to the front lines, and he knew that most of his ships were older and smaller than the alien vessels that had already been destroyed, but he also knew that humans had something the aliens did not understand. The something was experience with living on a world that tried to kill them every day through storms and earthquakes and diseases and predators. And this had taught humans how to survive when survival seemed impossible, and how to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. As the human ships prepared to launch, their crews worked with quiet efficiency, and there was no panic or crying because they had all volunteered for this mission, knowing that they might not come back, and they had made peace with that possibility. The alien observers who watched the human preparations were confused because they expected to see fear and despair, but instead, they saw people joking with each other and checking their equipment with calm professionalism, as if they were getting ready for a difficult but normal job. Some aliens whispered that humans must be too stupid to understand the danger they were facing, while others wondered if there was something about these Deathworld creatures that they had failed to notice, and a few began to think that maybe being born on a world that tried to kill you every day was not such a disadvantage after all. The first expeditionary fleet launched on a cold morning, when the stars were still visible in the sky, and thousands of people gathered to watch as the ships rose into space, carrying their friends and family members toward an enemy that had destroyed every force sent against it. As the ships disappeared into the darkness, Tae-ho stood on his bridge and looked back at Earth growing smaller behind them, and he thought about all the people depending on them, and all the aliens who thought they were marching toward certain death, and he smiled because they were about to learn something important about humans. The something they were about to learn was that being born on a death world did not make you weak or stupid, but instead, it taught you that the impossible was just another word for difficult, and that sometimes the only way to win was to keep fighting long after anyone sensible would have given up. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Altair system, and what they saw made even the most experienced crews stop and stare, because 3 massive bioships hung in space like diseased moons, and they were slowly eating the 4th planet while local defense forces watched from a safe distance. Captain Min-ho Yoon commanded the lead vessel Seoul's Pride, and he had fought in the border wars against pirates and raiders, but he had never seen anything like the swarm ships, which seemed to pulse and breathe like living creatures. Even though they were covered in metal armor that shifted and moved, Dr. Eunji Shin was his science officer, and she immediately began scanning the enemy vessels with every instrument they had while the rest of the bridge crew prepared for battle. And she quickly noticed something that the alien defenders had missed, because they were too afraid to get close enough to study their enemies properly. The bioships were phasing in and out of normal space in a pattern that seemed random at first, but when Yoonji ran the data through the computer, she discovered that it followed quantum fluctuations that were similar to phenomena they had studied in the deep ocean trenches back on Earth. She explained to Min-ho that the swarm ships were using some kind of quantum field manipulation to become untouchable, but the field had to reset every few seconds, and during those brief moments they would be solid and vulnerable. To attack, Min-ho listened to her report and looked at the tactical display showing the alien defense fleet hanging back at maximum range and firing weapons that passed harmlessly through the phasing bioships. And he understood why they had been defeated so easily, because they were fighting like civilized people instead of like humans. He opened a communication channel to the Zephyrian fleet commander and told him to watch and learn something new about warfare, and then he gave orders that made his own crew look at him like he had gone insane, because he told them to charge directly toward the largest bioship. Chief engineer Dong-wook Moon had been working frantically in the engine room ever since they arrived, and he had been modifying their weapons based on the quantum signature data that Yoonji was sending him. And when Min-ho gave the attack order, he was ready with something the galaxy had never seen before. The Soul's pride accelerated toward the bioships, and the alien observers held their breath because they were certain they were about to watch the humans die in the same way that so many others had died. But instead of passing through the enemy ship harmlessly, the human weapons began to have an effect. Dong-wook had retrofitted their particle cannons with quantum disruptors that were crude by galactic standards, but perfectly designed to interfere with the phase variance fields that protected the swarm ships. And when the weapons hit during the brief moments of solidity, they caused cascading failures in the bioship's defenses. The first bioship shuddered, and pieces of its hull began to break away and float in space like chunks of diseased flesh. And the swarm responded by trying to focus all three ships on the Soul's pride, but Minho was already moving his ship in an attack pattern that no alien commander had ever attempted. He flew directly into the spaces between the bioships where their weapons could not target him effectively, and used their own massive bulk as shields while his crew fired quantum-disrupted weapons at point-blank range. And the bioships began to show real damage for the first time since the war started. Communications officer Yeonseo Jang was coordinating with the other human ships, and she watched as they followed Soul's pride into battle formation and began executing maneuvers that would have been considered suicidal by any civilized military, but which made perfect sense to people who had learned warfare on a world where everything wanted to kill them. The battle was brutal and chaotic, and nothing like the neat formations and long-range duels that characterized most galactic conflicts, because the humans fought like pack hunters surrounding wounded prey, and they took terrible losses, but they never stopped attacking. When the first bioship's hull was breached, human boarding parties led by Marine Commander Jaemin Ko launched themselves across space in small assault pods and fought their way into the organic corridors inside the enemy vessel, where hand-to-hand combat was the only option. The interior of the bioship was like being inside the digestive system of some massive creature, and the walls pulsed with alien life while Swarm, defenders that looked like mechanical insects, tried to stop the human assault teams. But the Marines had trained for exactly this kind of fighting. Jaemin and his squad fought through corridors that tried to close on them and past defensive systems that fired living ammunition, and they used explosives and close-quarters weapons that alien military doctrine said were obsolete, but which worked perfectly in the confined spaces of the bioship. Behind them, engineer Han Yul Song and her team were placing charges on critical systems and studying the alien technology so they could understand how to fight it better, and every piece of information they gathered was transmitted back to the fleet for analysis. The second bioship tried to ram the Soul's pride, but Minho had anticipated this, and he used the ship's superior maneuverability to avoid the collision while firing everything he had at the bioship's neural clusters that Yoonji had identified as control centers. Meanwhile, the alien defense fleet watched in amazement as the impossible began to happen, and the humans started winning through sheer stubborn refusal to give up, even when they were taking casualties that would have broken any other species' morale. Lieutenant Woo-Sung Park commanded one of the smaller human vessels, and when his ship was badly damaged by bioweapon fire, he did not retreat, but instead rammed his vessel into a weak point in the third bioship's hull and led his surviving crew in a desperate assault on the enemy's power systems. The Zephyrian fleet commander sent a message asking if the humans needed assistance, and Minho replied that they were doing fine, and asked if the aliens wanted to learn some new tactics by watching how Deathworlders fought wars. By the end of the battle, 2 of the bioships were completely destroyed and the third was badly damaged and trying to escape, but the human ships pursued it and finished it off with concentrated fire from their quantum disruptors, while the alien fleet finally moved in to help with rescue and recovery operations. The cost had been terrible, and nearly half the human ships were destroyed or badly damaged, and hundreds of brave people had died. But they had achieved something that no other military force in the galaxy had managed, which was a complete victory over a swarm battle group. As rescue ships moved through the debris field looking for survivors, the alien crews were amazed by what they found, because human survivors were not crying or despairing, but were instead studying pieces of swarm technology and making plans for how to fight them better. Next time, Dr. Yeonji worked with alien scientists to analyze the captured bioship components, and she explained that the swarm's quantum phasing technology was actually based on principles that humans had observed in the deep ocean, where pressure and radiation created similar quantum effects. The alien scientists realized that humans had encountered these phenomena naturally on their homeworld and had developed an intuitive understanding of how to counter them, while more advanced civilizations had never needed to deal with such crude quantum effects, and therefore had no defense against them. Commander Kyung-ho led the salvage operations, and he made sure that every piece of useful technology was recovered and studied, while his teams also gathered the remains of fallen comrades for proper burial, because humans never left their dead behind. The battle at Altair became the first major victory against the Void Swarm, and news of it spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and for the first time since the invasion began, there was hope that the enemy could be defeated, but the victory had come at a price that made even hardened military commanders pause and think, because the human casualty rate was higher than any civilized species would accept, and yet the survivors seemed ready to do it all over again. The alien observers filed reports that their governments found hard to believe because they described a species that treated impossible odds as merely difficult challenges, and who seemed to thrive in exactly the kind of chaotic, desperate fighting that had defeated everyone else's. The human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next battle. Minho stood on his damaged bridge and looked out at the stars, where more swarm forces were waiting, and he smiled because he knew something that the galaxy was just beginning to understand. The thing he knew was that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting impossible odds on a world that tried to kill them every single day, and that experience had taught them the most important lesson in warfare, which was that you only lose when you stop fighting. News of the human victory at Altair spread across the galaxy faster than light travel, and suddenly every species that had given up hope was talking about the Deathworlders who had done the impossible. But Admiral Sun Ho-an looked at the casualty reports and knew they could not keep winning battles like this. The numbers were brutal and clear, and they showed that nearly 40% of his fleet had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and hundreds of his best people were dead or wounded. But somehow the survivors were already asking when they could fight again. Dr. Ha-Young Lim arrived from Earth with a convoy of research ships and medical vessels, and she brought with her the finest xenobiologists and combat medics that humanity could spare, along with equipment designed to study the swarm specimens that had been captured during the battle. She set up her laboratory on the command ship and began examining pieces of swarm biotechnology, and what she found made her stomach turn cold because the creatures were not just eating matter, but were somehow absorbing the knowledge and memories of every species they consumed. The bioships were filled with neural networks that contained the compressed thoughts and experiences of billions of dead beings, and each time the swarm destroyed a civilization, they became smarter and more adaptable by adding their victims' knowledge to their collective consciousness. This explained why the swarm had been getting better at fighting each new species they encountered, because they learned from every battle and every defeat, and incorporated new strategies and technologies into their vast shared mind. Ha-Young shared her findings with the military commanders, and they realized that the enemy they were fighting was not just powerful, but was getting stronger every day as it consumed more worlds and absorbed more civilizations into its growing intelligence. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, alien military leaders were studying recordings of the human tactics and trying to understand how a primitive species from a forbidden zone had succeeded, where their advanced civilizations had failed. General Kretor of the Andromedan Defense Corps watched the battle footage for the 100th time and still could not comprehend how humans could charge directly at certain death and somehow survive, while his own carefully planned strategies had resulted in complete defeat. The alien commanders had been trained in civilized warfare, where battles were fought at long range with sophisticated weapons and elegant tactics, but humans fought like wild animals that had learned to use tools, and their approach seemed to violate every principle of military science. What confused the aliens most was that humans seemed to maintain hope and even humor in situations that would drive any sensible species to despair, and they made jokes while preparing for battles they might not survive. Colonel Jae-Sung Kwan was assigned to lead the first joint task force that would include alien volunteers who had requested to serve alongside human forces, and the cultural exchange proved to be both difficult and educational for everyone involved. The Chronari warriors were used to individual combat where personal strength and honor mattered most, But they struggled to understand human teamwork, where weaker individuals could accomplish more than stronger ones by working together. The Velthian tacticians were brilliant at long-range planning and strategy, but they had never learned to adapt quickly when plans fell apart, the way they always did in real combat against an unpredictable enemy. Like the swarm. Slowly, the alien volunteers began to understand that Earth's harsh environment had not just produced tough warriors, but had created a species that excelled at improvisation and adaptation, because on a death world you either learned to change quickly or you died. The humans taught their alien comrades that sometimes the best strategy was to have no strategy at all but to simply react to whatever the enemy did, and keep attacking until either you won or you could not fight anymore. Intelligence officer Sujin Han spent her time studying swarm communication, patterns and movement data, and what she discovered made the situation even more frightening, because the enemy was beginning to adapt specifically to counter human tactics. The swarm had identified humanity as the primary threat to their expansion, and they were modifying their bioships and developing new weapons designed to neutralize the quantum disruptors and boarding tactics that had been so effective at Altair. This meant that the next battle would be much harder, because the element of surprise was gone, and the swarm would be prepared for human-style warfare. But it also meant that the galaxy finally had an enemy that took humanity seriously. Su Jin's analysis showed massive swarm forces gathering in 3 different sectors, and their movement patterns suggested they were planning to launch simultaneous attacks on heavily populated core worlds in an effort to force humanity to spread their limited forces too thin. The target worlds were HFY with its population of 12 billion beings, New Geneva with its important manufacturing centers, and Harmony Station itself, where the Galactic Council met and where attacking would have enormous psychological impact on every species in the galaxy. Admiral Sun Ho-an realized that this was exactly the kind of impossible strategic situation that would paralyze any normal military commander, because there were not enough human ships to defend all 3 locations properly, and any choice would mean abandoning billions of innocent people to certain death. But humans had learned long ago that when faced with impossible choices, you did not waste time trying to find perfect solutions, but instead you did the best you could with what you had, and accepted that some battles could only be won by those willing to pay any price. He divided his remaining forces into 3 groups and assigned each one to defend one of the target worlds, even though he knew that each group would be outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, and that victory would require not just courage but also luck and the kind of tactical brilliance that emerged from desperation. Captain Bo Young-no was given command of the force defending HFY, and she spent her time studying the planet's geography and industrial infrastructure, looking for ways to turn civilian facilities into military assets, the way humans had always done on Earth. Lieutenant Commander Seok-jin Lee took his ships to New Geneva and began working with the local population to organize civilian evacuation and emergency production of weapons and supplies, because human military doctrine had always assumed that everyone would have to fight when survival was at stake. The 3rd force went to defend Harmony Station under the command of Admiral Sun Ho-an himself, because he knew that if the seat of galactic government fell, the psychological impact would shatter the already fragile alliance that held the defense together as the human fleets moved toward their assigned positions. Alien observers noted that there was no panic or despair among the crews, but instead there was a calm determination that seemed to grow stronger as the odds became more hopeless. The aliens were beginning to understand that humans were not fearless, but rather that they had learned to function effectively while afraid, and that their fear actually made them fight harder instead of running away. Dr. Ha-Young Lim continued her research on captured swarm specimens and made a disturbing discovery about the way their collective consciousness worked, because it appeared that they could share tactical information instantly across vast distances, which meant that anything learned by one bioship would immediately be known by all others. This quantum communication network was what made the swarm so adaptable and dangerous, but it also represented a potential vulnerability, because any system that connected everything together could theoretically be used to attack the entire network. At once she began working on theoretical countermeasures while the fleets prepared for what everyone knew would be the largest space battle in galactic history. and she hoped that her research would provide some advantage that could tip the balance in humanity's favor. The preparations continued around the clock as human engineers worked to modify every available weapon and defense system, while medical teams prepared for casualties that would dwarf anything they had seen before, and communication. Specialists established networks that could coordinate the defense across multiple star systems. As reports arrived, showing massive swarm fleets moving toward all three target worlds. Simultaneously, the alien members of the joint task forces began to understand why humans called their homeworld a death world, because it had taught them to face extinction with steady hands and clear minds. The stage was set for the greatest test humanity had ever faced, and as the enemy fleets approached their targets, Admiral Sun Ho-an sent a message to all human forces that contained just 6 words, but those words carried the weight of their entire species' determination to survive. The message said simply, "Remember Earth and make them pay," and across 3 star systems. Human warriors prepared to prove that sometimes the only way to save the galaxy was to be willing to die for people who had never even heard of your homeworld. The Battle of the Trinity Worlds began when 3 massive swarm fleets dropped out of hyperspace simultaneously, and their bioships blotted out the stars like living eclipses, while human defenders prepared to face odds that no rational species would have accepted. Fleet Admiral Bora Sio commanded the combined Galactic Defense Fleet from her flagship, and she watched as sensor readings showed enemy numbers that made even experienced officers shake their heads, because for every human ship, there were 50 swarm vessels waiting to destroy it. At HFY-Prime, Captain Bo Young-no positioned her small force between the planet and the approaching bioships, and she knew that conventional tactics would result in complete annihilation. Within minutes, but humans had stopped using conventional tactics the day they learned that the universe wanted them dead. The swarm had adapted since Altair, and their bioships now carried quantum shields specifically designed to counter human disruptor weapons, while their new neural networks allowed them to coordinate attacks with perfect precision across thousands of individual vessels. Captain In Young Shin piloted the experimental ship, Indomitable, directly toward the largest bioship in the enemy formation, and her crew knew they were flying toward certain death. But they also knew that someone had to get close enough to study the enemy's new defenses. Weapons specialist Chang-Min Park worked frantically at his station trying to find frequencies that could penetrate the new swarm shields, while Navigator Ari Kim plotted a course that would take them through the heaviest enemy fire, because sometimes the most dangerous path was also the safest. The bioship they were approaching was the size of a small moon, and its hull pulsed with organic life while mechanical weapons tracked their movement and began firing streams of living projectiles that seemed to hunt their target like predatory animals. In Young threw her ship into evasive maneuvers that would have killed anyone not born on a high-gravity world. But her crew held on and kept working, because they had trained for this moment their entire lives, and they were not going to waste it by dying. Quietly, Chang-Min managed to punch a hole through the bioship's hull with a concentrated barrage of modified quantum torpedoes, and In Young immediately flew through the breach into the creature's internal cavity, where they found themselves surrounded by organic corridors that pulsed like arteries. Fighting inside a living ship was like being swallowed by a whale that was trying to digest them while they were still alive, and the walls secreted acid, while mechanical antibodies attacked them with weapons that grew from the floor and ceiling. The crew fought their way deeper into the bioship, following Ari's readings toward what appeared to be a massive neural cluster at the creature's heart, and every step forward cost them blood and ammunition, but they kept moving because stopping meant dying. Meanwhile, on the surface of HFY-Prime, Lieutenant Commander Wu Jin-che led ground forces against swarm harvest machines that had landed to begin consuming the planet, and his soldiers included combat medic Mi Young-yu and demolitions expert Sang Ho-bei. The harvest machines were like mechanical locusts the size of buildings, and they stripped away everything they touched and converted it into raw material for building more swarm vessels. But they had never encountered an enemy that fought back from inside their own digestive systems. Wu Jin's troops used tactics learned from centuries of guerrilla warfare on Earth, and they struck at the machines from unexpected angles, while Sang Ho placed explosives in locations that would cause maximum damage to critical systems. The aliens who fought alongside them were amazed by human willingness to crawl inside enemy machines and plant bombs by hand, even when the chances of survival were almost zero. But Mi-young explained that on Earth they had learned that sometimes sacrifice was the only way to protect others. Back in space, the battle raged across 3 star systems as human ships engaged in the kind of desperate close quarters combat that alien military doctrine said was impossible, but which humans had been practicing since they first picked up rocks to defend their caves at New Geneva. Lieutenant Commander Seok Jin Lee discovered that the swarm's new quantum communication network had an unexpected vulnerability because it could not process or understand concepts that were completely foreign to every species they had previously absorbed. The swarm collective consciousness was built from the accumulated knowledge and experience of conquered civilizations, but none of those civilizations had ever developed the concept of willing self-sacrifice for strangers, because species that evolved that trait tended to survive and avoid being conquered. This created a logical paradox in the swarm's neural networks because they could not comprehend why humans would choose to die for people they had never met. And this incomprehension began to cause processing errors in their quantum communication system. Dr. Jin Ho No's research team on Earth had been working around the clock to develop countermeasures against the swarm's collective intelligence, and they had created a theoretical logic virus that could exploit this conceptual blindness. The virus was designed to propagate through the swarm's quantum network by presenting it with scenarios involving human self-sacrifice that would cause cascade failures in their decision-making processes as they tried to understand motivations that were literally incomprehensible. To their collective mind, Captain In-young Shin and her crew reached the neural core of the massive bioship and found themselves in a chamber that contained the compressed consciousness of billions of absorbed beings, all connected through organic, neural pathways that pulsed with alien thoughts. The horror of what they discovered was almost overwhelming because they could hear the screams and pleas of every civilization that the swarm had consumed, and they realized that their enemies were not just conquerors but were torturers who kept their victims alive and aware for eternity. Changmin began placing the logic virus transmitters while Ari worked to interface with the bioship's communication systems, and In-young held off the mechanical defenders that swarmed through the chamber trying to stop them. The virus began to propagate through the network, and almost immediately they could see its effects as the bioship systems started to malfunction, and its coordinated attacks became erratic and confused as processing nodes throughout the swarm fleet tried to understand human motivations, and failed. Across all 3 battlefields, the tide began to turn as swarm vessels lost coordination and began making tactical errors, while their quantum communication network became clogged with recursive logical loops that consumed processing power and caused system failures. At Harmony Station, Admiral Sun Ho-an watched as enemy bioships that had been perfectly coordinated moments before began firing on each other and crashing into obstacles as their collective intelligence tried to process the logical impossibility of humans choosing death over survival. The breakthrough had come at a terrible cost, because nearly 70% of human forces had been destroyed or damaged, and thousands of brave people had died to buy the time needed to implement the countermeasures. But their sacrifice was not in vain, as the swarm fleets began to retreat or go dormant. Alien observers realized they had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history, because a primitive species from a forgotten world had saved an entire galaxy through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The victory was incomplete because swarm forces still controlled hundreds of star systems, but for the first time since the invasion began, they were vulnerable and confused and no longer seemed like an unstoppable force of nature. Captain In-young Shin's team barely escaped the collapsing bioship, but they had successfully implanted the logic virus into the swarm's core network, and now every bioship in the galaxy would have to deal with the conceptual paradox of human courage as rescue ships moved through the debris fields looking for survivors. The alien crews found humans who were wounded and exhausted, but still asking about the next mission, because they understood that the war was not over, and that the galaxy would need their help again. The Battle of the Trinity Worlds became the turning point in the war against the Void Swarm, but it also marked the moment when the galaxy began to truly understand what it meant to be human, and why being born on a death world was not a curse, but a gift. Admiral Bo-Ra Seo sent her final report to the Galactic Council and in it she wrote that humanity had taught the galaxy the most important lesson in warfare, which was that some things were worth dying for, and that true victory could only be achieved by those willing to pay any price to protect others. The logic virus spread through the swarm's quantum network like a plague of confusion, and across hundreds of star systems bioships began shutting down or turning against each other as their collective consciousness tried to process the impossible concept of willing self-sacrifice and failed catastrophically. Ambassador Kyung-suk O stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Council and watched as reports poured in from every sector, showing swarm forces retreating or going dormant, while alien delegates sat in stunned silence trying to understand how their galaxy had been saved by the species they had once considered too primitive to matter. The great bioships that had seemed unstoppable just weeks before were now floating, dead in space or consuming themselves in fits of mechanical madness as their neural networks collapsed under the weight of trying to understand human nature and finding it completely incomprehensible. Species that had been writing their own epitaphs and preparing for extinction were suddenly discussing reconstruction plans and expansion programs, while their military leaders studied human tactical manuals and tried to learn lessons that could only be taught by those who had grown up expecting the universe to try to kill them. Commander Seungwon Pyo led the final assault on the swarm's origin point, which was a massive bioconstruct hidden in the dangerous radiation fields of the galactic core, and his team discovered the remains of the first species to be consumed by the creatures they had created to defend themselves. The ancient builders had been a peaceful civilization that faced extinction from aggressive neighbors, and in their desperation, they had created biological weapons that could adapt and learn from any enemy. But they had made the fatal mistake of assuming that survival was the highest priority for any intelligent species. When their bioweapons encountered the concept of self-sacrifice for others, they had been as confused as their modern descendants, and they had turned on their creators because beings willing to die for strangers made no sense according to their programmed understanding of intelligent behavior. The irony was not lost on Seungwon and his team that the greatest threat in galactic history had been defeated by the same force that had created it, which was the inability to understand that some things were more important than individual survival. As the last swarm vessels were destroyed or captured, the galaxy entered a new age of cooperation and understanding, because the war had taught every species that diversity was not just valuable, but essential for survival when facing threats that could not be defeated by conventional thinking. Dr. Ji-hyun Ro established the Interspecies Research Initiative to study Deathworld adaptations and their applications to galactic challenges, and what had once been considered humanity's greatest disadvantage was now understood to be their most valuable contribution to galactic civilization. The research showed that harsh environments did not just produce physically tough species, but created minds that were flexible and creative, and capable of finding solutions that more comfortable civilizations would never consider, because they had never needed to think outside the boundaries of normal existence. Military academies across the galaxy began teaching courses based on human tactical doctrine, and officer candidates learned that sometimes the most effective strategy was to do exactly what the enemy expected to be impossible, because rational beings would never attempt something so dangerous. The memorial of sacrifice was built in orbit around Earth, and its walls contained the names of 60,000 humans who had died to save trillions of alien lives, while its central chamber housed recordings of their final messages to families they would never see again. Representatives from every species in the galaxy gathered for the dedication ceremony, and as they read the names and listened to the messages, many of them began to understand why humans had been willing to fight impossible odds for people they had never met. The memorial's inscription was written in every galactic language, and it said simply that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else was more important than being afraid, and that freedom could only be preserved by those willing to die for it. Admiral Tae-ho Kim had been promoted to Supreme Allied Commander after the war, and he delivered the keynote address at the memorial service, while wearing the dress uniform of a species that had been dismissed as primitive just months before. His speech was short and simple, and he said that humans had not saved the galaxy because they were fearless or superior, but because they understood that some things were worth being afraid for, and that the greatest strength came from those who had learned to endure the greatest hardships. The audience listened in silence as he explained that Earth was a harsh world that had taught its children that life was precious precisely because it was fragile, and that the only way to protect what mattered was to be willing to sacrifice everything for it. After the ceremony, delegates from across the galaxy approached human representatives with requests for cultural exchanges and joint training programs because they wanted their own people to learn the lessons that could only be taught by those who had grown up on a death world. The Chronari sent their finest warriors to train with human marines and learn that true strength came not from individual power, but from the willingness to die for your comrades. While the Velthians requested help in developing military doctrines based on improvisation rather than rigid planning, the Andromedan Defense Corps wanted to understand how humans maintained hope and humor in desperate situations, and they discovered that laughter was not a sign of weakness but a weapon that could defeat despair when everything seemed lost as reconstruction efforts began across the galaxy. Human engineers worked alongside alien scientists to rebuild the devastated worlds, and they brought with them techniques developed on Earth for surviving in hostile environments and making life possible in places that seemed uninhabitable. The planets that had been partially consumed by the swarm were restored using terraforming, methods that humans had developed to tame their own world, and what had once been dead rock became green and living again. As species that had given up hope began to dream of the future. Children who had been born during the war grew up in a galaxy where humans were not seen as primitive Deathworlders, but as the species that had taught the universe what courage meant, and they played games where they pretended to be brave Marines, fighting impossible odds. The schools on every world taught the history of the Swarm War, and students learned that sometimes the most important battles were won, not by the strongest or smartest, but by those who refused to give up. When giving up would have been the reasonable thing to do, trade routes that had been abandoned during the invasion reopened and carried not just goods but ideas and cultural exchanges, as species that had barely communicated before the war began sharing knowledge and learning from each other's unique perspectives. The humans established colonies on worlds that other species considered too dangerous or difficult, and they turned hostile environments into thriving settlements while teaching their neighbors that adversity was not something to be avoided, but something to be overcome. Dr. Hei Young Lim continued her research into swarm biology and developed medical treatments based on their adaptive healing systems, and what had once been humanity's greatest enemy became the source of cures for diseases that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. The quantum communication networks that had been used to coordinate the swarm were repurposed for peaceful applications and allowed instant communication across the galaxy, while the bioship technology was adapted for exploration vessels that could survive in environments that would destroy conventional craft as years passed, and the immediate memory of the war began to fade. The galaxy settled into a new peace that was built on the understanding that diversity was strength, and that the most valuable citizens were often those who came from the most difficult circumstances. The final scene of the Great War's aftermath took place in a park on New Geneva, where human children played with alien youngsters, while their parents worked together on projects that had seemed impossible before they learned to combine alien innovation with human determination. An elderly Velthian grandmother watched the children playing and remembered the dark days when her species had given up hope and prepared for extinction, and she marveled at how the galaxy had been saved by beings from a world that most civilized species had considered uninhabitable. She approached a human mother who was watching her own daughter teach alien children how to play a game that involved taking turns being brave in the face of imaginary dangers, and she asked what humans called the quality that had allowed them to save the galaxy. The human woman smiled and said that they called it hope, and that it was something you could only learn by growing up in a place where hope was the only thing that stood between you and despair, and where every day taught you that tomorrow was worth fighting for. The alien grandmother nodded and understood finally why being born on a death world was not a curse but a gift, because it taught its children that life was beautiful, precisely because it was difficult, and that the greatest victories belonged to those who never stopped believing that impossible just meant challenging.